Alrighty, well, thanks, Sal, Stanislaus Audubon, everybody for coming out tonight. Thanks for having me. Hopefully you guys are warm and dry inside. I know California is getting dumped on. Um, Glad to be back. Very excited. This is my first time giving this presentation since I created it. So this is the maiden voyage, so to speak. So thanks everybody for bearing with me. And obviously, we're going to Costa Rica. And title of tonight's presentation is The Magic of Central America, Costa Rica's Birds and Ecology. And I'll be your host, Benny Jacob Schwartz, aka Birds by Beaches. Our presentation will be, I'll put my timer on, make sure I'm on time. Shouldn't be more than 45 to 50 minutes. So I'm just going to make sure of that. And
Benny, can I say something here? Those of you who have any questions, either put them in the chat or save them for after the program, or you can put them in the chat as you go along. Sorry, go ahead.
No, that's perfect. Yeah, that's great. Okay, awesome. So we'll get started. So a little bit about myself. I always share a little bit about my background. So my business does birds, tours, and threads. So what that means is I lead like local birding walks. This is out in Lake Merritt. I also have like a small clothing line, which is basically to kind of, when I first got into birding, there wasn't a whole lot of folks in my demographic, really. I wasn't really seeing people. And I was like, wow, this is weird. Like birding is amazing. I wonder why people my age aren't as fired up about it. And so I wanted to kind of shift the paradigm and kind of open up birding as like a different conversation. And so a lot of people my age, I think, wanted things to be like more fashionable and more interesting as opposed to like maybe a traditional roots of birding. And so I wanted to take kind of a different approach to get people's attention. And so I kind of developed this different clothing line and started with the tank tops and just keeping it fun, keeping it interesting. And I also do international birding tours. I have a couple to Costa Rica in 2024, and then another one in Ecuador in the Northwest region. And so tonight we're going to get into our presentation. And so all my talks, I really like to start generally and move my way into some more specific topics, including like case studies to really drive home the points. And so if you guys have any questions that come up, feel free to shoot them in the chat and then we'll answer them at the end. So Costa Rica. So let's head there. So Costa Rica is located within Central America, for anybody that didn't know that. And it is incredibly green. This is satellite imagery. It's pretty tropical. And there's some really beautiful locations like the Osa Peninsula, the Nicoya Peninsula to the north. And then there's various mountain ranges within the center of the country. And we're going to talk about those a little bit further. But I just wanted to provide a little bit of kind of aerial context as to where we're going. And we're going to talk about the birds that we're going to see. And so my central, just for a little bit of context, so there's a lot of different ways to explore Costa Rica. You know, you can go on your own or you can go on a group tour, which obviously is quite fun, and local guides and professional birding opportunities, and they know where all the amazing lodges are. And so that's how my trips are set up. And so one of the trips that I'm offering is a northern region tour that basically starts in San Jose and then goes up towards La Fortuna and then goes up towards Caña Negro and then goes towards the Caribbean lowlands and then wraps up and finishes back in the center. And then there's another one that goes through the Central Sur region, which basically goes from San Jose into the Talamanca Highlands to photograph resplendent quetzals, fiery-throated hummingbirds, and other kind of high elevation cloud forest species. And then we make our way back down slope, a couple other spots down here. And then we head down towards the Pacific lowlands into the Carrara area, birding these areas, sunset boat birding tour, mangrove stuff. So both of these trips, I design all my trips to be complementary so that folks can see a different assemblage of birds on each trip so that it's not trying to avoid repeat species as much as possible. But obviously, there's a lot of birds that have widespread ranges. So that being said, there are a lot of different ways to explore Costa Rica, and there are a lot of different areas, and we're going to talk about that. So Costa Rica Spark Notes, okay? So a little bit of context. Costa Rica is about 20,000 square miles, and it's just a bit smaller than West Virginia. And it's been its own independent nation since 1821, which has allowed for a lot of different things to happen in Costa Rica. One of which is that it's been able to prioritize its own development, and it hasn't really had to pay taxes, so to speak, to another country, as opposed to many other nations in Latin America that were colonized up until relatively recently. Like Belize, I believe, was previously considered British Honduras, or I forget what it used to be called, but Costa Rica's had a long time to kind of develop itself. And one of the other interesting things is that it's had its military disbanded since about 1940. So it's been able to prioritize some of its internal revenue into things like education and overall infrastructure. So it's really quite a fascinating place to travel, and probably the top developed, has the highest development of ecotourism, like facilities, of anywhere potentially in the world. And it's got a relatively small population size with around 5 million people, most of which that live in the capital of San Jose. And like I said before, they've invested a lot in education. And so there's roughly 97% literacy rate in the country, which is pretty outstanding. And ecotourism accounts for about 11% of the total GDP. And this was a stat basically taken in 2019 before the onset of the pandemic. And so now it's kind of rebounding in the last 6 to 8 months. So those are some kind of general spark notes about the country. And then as far as land conservation goes, Costa Rica didn't always have incredible conservation practices. There was a lot of deforestation that was being subsidized by the United States for lowland tropical rainforest conversion into plantations like banana and pineapple, as well as deforestation for from companies like McDonald's to produce hamburgers and things like that. And so there's not as much primary rainforest intact as there was prior to these periods, but there has been a tremendous rebound in terms of conservation ethics as the country has continued to prioritize those. And so currently 25% of Costa Rica's terrestrial landscape is protected. And so that's actually broken down into a variety of different kind of subcategories, including 28 national parks, 58 wildlife refuges, 32 what they call protected zones, 15 wetlands and mangrove habitats, 11 forest reserves. So Costa Rica is extremely diverse, very similar to California in the way, right? California has its own floristic province. We have, a variety of different mountain ranges that influence the biodiversity within the state. So Costa Rica is very similar in that way, right? So if we look closely, we can see that it's very narrow. I don't know exactly what the distance across is, but it has the Caribbean Sea on one side, the Pacific Ocean on another. So just right there, there's two dramatic influences. So there's a whole Caribbean slope of species, and then there's a Pacific slope of species. And these are just general terms. There's a lot of more kind of specific speciation that's occurred due to different factors, including these different mountain ranges, as well as there's a variety of really tall volcanoes within the country that have their own microclimates. So we're going to talk about these climates in a little bit. But as you can see, there's like the Guanacaste mountain range. There's kind of this central volcanic cordillera or mountain range. And then there's the Talamanca mountains that go into northwest Panama. And so each of these mountains hold a different assemblage of species. And some obviously have ranges, like I said before, that are found throughout the area. But to see a lot of different species in Costa Rica, the best way to do that is to visit a variety of different sites. And Costa Rica actually has more species of birds than the United States and Canada basically put together. And so, which is about 900 species, and about 47 of them are basically endemic to Costa Rica and found nowhere else in the world. So here's a different look at Costa Rica from a topographical viewpoint. So we saw before kind of a loose topography with highlighting some of the mountains, but this is really a dramatic look at the topography. And so in some areas in Costa Rica, you can see that it gets up to about 11,000 or 12,000 feet in elevation, these really high volcanoes. And this is some unique habitat, which is not very common. It's called Paramo habitat, or there's also subalpine. And then it goes all the way down into these Caribbean lowlands. And so basically at sea level. And so each of these different areas there's a lot of we'll get to that one in the next one. So long story short, Costa Rica is extremely diverse, and the beautiful thing about San Jose and exploring is that for early naturalists to kind of catalog the biodiversity of the country, it was easy to do day trips out to these different regions, because San Jose, you can get to a lot of different places in about 2.5 hours or 3 hours or more, right? From San Jose to the Osa Peninsula is about 6 or 7 hours. And the Osa Peninsula is this really unique location that was basically an island that slammed into the Central American kind of isthmus or continent or whatever you want to call it. And so there's a whole different assemblage of species. And this is like one of the most dense and intense biological regions in the world as well as in the country. So there's a lot to see here. And I've been to Costa Rica probably a dozen times, and I've only seen 550 something species in a place that hosts 900. So there's quite a lot to see here and an amazing opportunity. And so there's another ecological concept called Holdridge's life zones. And so they're kind of confusing, but basically it was an attempt to kind of catalog and specify these different regions based on these biotic and abiotic factors, including rainfall, elevation, temperature, precipitation, and things like that. So if you look at this map from a life zone perspective, you can see how it kind of is broken down, right? So we have in the Northwest, we have this tropical dry forest habitat. And then we have a lot of this pre-montane wet forest. And then it gets higher up into different habitats like cloud forest, which I forget is what that's defined as. But at any rate, there's a lot of different life zones here, which make for species observing, searching, really fun as you move through these different life zones. And so, like I said, those tours that I had, if you look for them, right, it starts and cruises across these different life zones, heading into Caño Negro wetlands, into the Caribbean lowlands, exploring kind of this tropical pre-montane wet forest, and certain areas are cloud forest. So there's a lot to see here. And so, so Costa Rica's home, like I said, it's only roughly the size of West Virginia, but a common fact is that it has 5% of global biodiversity, which makes it one of the most biodiverse regions in the world. And so, like I said before, there's about 900 species of birds reported in Costa Rica, hailing from 82 different families. And it's not just birds that are crazy down here. There's about 225 species of reptiles, 200 plus amphibians, 35,000 species of insects, 9,000 species of flowering plants, just shy of 2,000 species of trees, and it is crazy. Now, a lot of people ask, oh, when's a good time to go to Costa Rica? Well, really, there's no bad time to go to Costa Rica, but they do have a very distinct seasonality, at least in much of the country. So there's what we call the dry season and the rainy season. They only have two seasons, so to speak. So the dry season is loosely defined as like mid-November through April. And then the rainy season really starts to get going in May to mid-November. But the Caribbean side can be totally different, where there's typically, when it's rainy, there can be pockets of kind of high pressure systems where it's not very rainy on the Caribbean side. And it could rain really at any point in any day of any time of the year. And with the climate changing so much, these kind of seasons are shifting, just like we're noticing here in California, especially this year. Okay, so like I said before, seasonality is a really important factor. So we'll just rewind for 1 second. So the dry season in Costa Rica is basically mid-November through April. And so our winter in North America, obviously, that's basically when migrants start moving in large numbers, right? Shorebirds start moving earlier from Alaska in August and things like that. But if we look at the next map here, we can see that these are migration pathways through the Western Hemisphere. And so as you see here, a lot of birds are passing through Central America. Now, some of them choose to winter in Central America, and some of them are just what we call passage migrants, which literally migrate through a specific area where they spend the actual non-breeding season. So what's amazing is that a lot of the birds that spend the breeding season in North America will winter in Latin America, especially in Central America. And so when it's cold and rainy for folks in North America, a lot of folks like to travel and be snowbirds and enjoy the warmer dry season weather. And so the upside of traveling during the dry season is that Latin America is chock full with a lot of migratory species. So if you're enjoying listing and wanting to see lots of bird species, the dry season or the dry season is a great time because all of the migrants are there. And then if you're late in the if you stay late during the dry season, you can also see the migrants returning. So very cool. And broad scale landscape based conservation is important, right? Like I talked about, a lot of places in the world are being deforested. And so it's great that Costa Rica has prioritized conserving up to at least 25% of its land so that it can regenerate and continue to be a safe haven for breeding birds that reside there year round, as well as neotropical migrants that spend the non-breeding season or pass through. All right, so that's a little bit of the brief history and kind of the ecological components within Costa Rica. And so initially I was considering kind of breaking out kind of species composition by region, but that would be a much longer presentation. And so how this next section is going to go is basically broken down by family, and then we're going to talk a little bit about each of these kind of families and some of the species, or some of like the examples of species that are represented within them. So Anhinga, we have these in the United States, but they are quite common in wetlands, and aka the snakebird. And Costa Rica only has 2 species of grebes. There's the least grebe here and the pie-billed grebe. I didn't include that picture because we see them all the time at home, I'm sure. And I'm following kind of taxonomic order. And so, like I said before, there's a lot of birds that winter or spend the non-breeding season in Latin America, especially shorebirds. There's a ton of shorebirds that winter along the coast, as well as in these inland kind of ponds and salt flats. And so these look like a bunch of Western sandpipers cruising around, and shorebirds galore, marble godwits, willets, some other things hiding around in there. And so here's a whole crew of birds enjoying themselves as they do along the southern coast of California and Mexico and other parts of Latin America as well. And on my last trip to Costa Rica, I got to see a Wilson's plover, which was a big lifer for me. And then I just got to see it again in Texas, got it for my United States list, and that was very exciting. So if you're a fan of shorebirds, Costa Rica is a cool time to observe them as well. Now getting into some storks. Now there are 2 storks pictured in this photo. One is the wood stork, and next to it is the jabiru, and that is not a stork. Now the jabiru are crazy. I haven't seen one in Costa Rica before, but we should see them on the Caño Negro and like the central north tour up into the Caño Negro wetlands. But these birds are massive and they build large platform nests. And the jabiru, as you can see, is extremely large, especially in comparison to the wood stork, even though the wood stork is still quite a large bird. Alrighty, so we're moving on to herons, ibises, and allies. So there's a lot of wetland habitat in certain parts of the country. And so there's a wide variety of herons and waders that can be found there, including white ibis, green ibis, roseate spoonbill, tricolored heron, and one of the most enigmatic of all herons is the boat-billed heron, which we'll look out for on our Sunset Mangrove birding tour up the Tarcoles River. And as you can see, they have a ridiculous bill, and they generally roost kind of in secluded mangrove habitat. They like to like hunker down in the mangroves, and this is a really awesome opportunity to observe them. And they are just ridiculous looking. They almost look cartoonesque and kind of reminiscent of shoebills. And so I forgot to mention that most of the media in this presentation is stuff that I've captured and created. And then there's also an assemblage of a couple other photographers, including our local tour operator and amazing bird guide for our Costa Rica tours named Juan Diego. And so he was graciously lent me some of his media to include in this presentation. And so this boat-billed heron video was his as well. Now, one of the most maybe mythic of all wading birds from Latin America and potentially the world is the agami heron. These guys are found predominantly in Caribbean wetland areas. Tortuguero is kind of like the spot for agami herons, but there are also other places to view them. And as you can see, these wading birds are well adapted for hunting in relatively deep water. They've got long legs like other waders, and they are quite beautiful to say the least. So moving on to rails and gallinules and allies. We've got purple gallinule, which we have mostly in Florida, I think. Oops, that slide got repeated. And then the russet-naped wood rail. These are really cool. they're very unique. Obviously, in the same family, longish legs. They hunt for invertebrates and snails and things like that. And they're not super shy. So these are cool birds to be able to photograph. And this bird was photographed at the same place while I was scouting for these tours. This is the white-throated crake. We don't really have, I don't think we have crake in the United States, but there's a handful of crake species in Costa Rica, and they're generally very secretive and hard to find. But there's one spot on our northern tour that we go that has a couple resident white-throated crakes there, and this one put on quite a show, and maybe one of my favorite bird photos I ever snapped. Alrighty, so I'm not including all the bird families, but there are some that are very unique, like this sun bittern. Now, this bird is crazy looking, and I spent a lot of time looking at the field guides on my own and just like relaxing, daydreaming about birds. And I had never seen a sun bittern until maybe December 2021 on a trip to Costa Rica. And they blew me away. These guys are really unique. They hang out around aquatic areas, cruising around looking for invertebrates and fish. And although they don't look crazy from kind of when their wings aren't spread, but when they fly, they have this really incredible pattern that I believe is used to kind of to scare off potential predators, to make it look like giant false eyes. And so the lighting was really dark when I was shooting this bird. And so when it took off, it created this really incredible motion blur, kind of a more artsy look at this species. And this is the sun bittern. Alrighty, moving on to chachalacas, guans, and curassows. Now, this is a family of birds that are basically like tropical turkeys, and they often hang out. Chachalacas hang out in large groups. They're very noisy. They're arboreal, but they also come down to feeders and cruise around looking for a wide variety of things. And so this is the gray-headed chachalaca. This is the black guan. These are a little bit larger and also very interesting. This is a tight head chomp, but they have a very similar body type as the rest of the members in its family. And this is probably the most gorgeous of all the chachalaca, guan, curassow members. This is the great curassow. Now, this bird was basically on the verge of extinction for a long time due to hunting pressures, as well as habitat loss and fragmentation. But like I said, Costa Rica has really been prioritizing conservation in a lot of areas. And so the La Selva Biological Station is probably the best place in Costa Rica to see the great curassow. And that's one of the spots that we'll be visiting on the northern tour. And they are just like ridiculously handsome. Can't get enough of these birds. Alrighty, Columbidae, or pigeons and doves. Now, there's quite a few pigeons and doves, and many of which are extremely elusive, hard to get photos of, and forest-dwelling secretive ones. And so I'll feature just a few tonight. This is the ruddy ground dove. We do have them kind of, basically they go as far as Southeast Arizona, as far as like they kind of qualify as rare bird alerts, but ruddy ground doves are relatively common in drier lowland habitats in Costa Rica, as well as Inca doves. Very cool. Scaling, dove body, pigeon lifestyle. What could go wrong? And then there's a whole different assemblage of doves called quail doves. And so these guys basically cruise around on the trails, dark forest understory, looking for grubs, seeds, berries, and things like that have fallen. And they're often very shy and hard to photograph. This is a photo from Juan Diego of a purplish backed quail dove. And there's a whole assemblage of them. If you're interested in learning about more of them, you can download the Merlin app and get the Costa Rica pack, or pick up a field guide to birds, and you can check out the Costa Rica plates for doves. They're really beautiful. Alrighty, getting into vultures, hawks, and allies. Now, there are a lot of raptors in Costa Rica. Um, we get black vulture in the southern parts of the United States, like Texas and Florida. And from a distance, they don't really look very special. But when you get up close and personal, you can see that these birds are extremely remarkable. And like all vultures, black vultures are an essential part of the ecosystem, right? They help break down rotting and decaying flesh and recycle it into the earth so that the nutrients can be uptaken by vegetation. And without vultures, there would be tons and tons and tons of rotting, disgusting, horrifically smelling carcasses around the planet. So next time you see a vulture, say thank you for doing the dirty work. And not all vultures were created equally. This is the most beautiful vulture, in my opinion. This is the king vulture. And there's some really incredible places to photograph these behind photography hides where they put down pig heads or pig legs and the vultures come down. This was actually totally a natural, spontaneous moment. We were cruising around Carrara National Park looking for birds, believe it or not. And then we saw this large white bird fly out of nowhere, perch, and I was able to get a couple decent shots of this beautiful bird. Alrighty, now we're gonna talk about some raptors again. So we've got a double-toothed kite. These guys are really much smaller than the vultures. These guys eat live animals. There's the gray hawk, which is often seen perching along roadsides or in kind of open trees, as well as overhead on warm days. And then there's the common black hawk and the great black hawk. So these are sometimes challenging to tell apart, but in the right habitat and looking for the right field marks, like a massive tail and some other subtle details in the plumage, you can kind of differentiate the common black hawk from the great black hawk. A really common raptor throughout much of Costa Rica is the roadside hawk. And just like its name says, if you're wondering what you're seeing, it's probably a roadside hawk if it's perched alongside the road on a telephone pole or on a fence post or anything like that. One of the most emblematic, enigmatic, either way, really special hawks in Costa Rica and other parts of South America is the white hawk. Now, the first time I saw this bird was on the Osa Peninsula at a spot called Finca La Tarde, and I was looking for birds, and I learned that when I went out with the landowner who's like / bird guide, he was saying that a great way to look for white hawks is to follow troops of capuchin monkeys, because the white hawks basically wake hunt off of the activity stirred up from the capuchin monkeys and the squirrel monkeys. And so as the capuchin monkeys are kind of foraging through bromeliads and cruising through the forest, a lot of insects get churned up. And so the white hawk will basically take advantage of the activity that's being created by the monkeys and then swoop in and get an easy meal. And so this is what we call, not necessarily wake hunting, but like associations. And so just kind of furthering the importance of protecting ecological landscapes as a whole, because no one species could exist without the other. These animals and these plants and these regions are deeply interconnected. Now, there's basically 3 species of hawk eagles in Costa Rica. And for the last several years, there's been some really incredible places to see and photograph ornate hawk eagles in Costa Rica. And so this was photographed in Monteverde up in the cloud forest. And this is an ornate hawk eagle nest, an ornate hawk eagle chick. And as you can see on the right-hand side of the frame, there's what looks like maybe a small, like a possum or a very large rat that the adult has brought for the chick. Here's a different look at the same nest. These birds are breathtaking, to say the least. This is an adult with its plumage. It's got this kind of crest on the top of its head and really dark barring, this black moustachial stripe that kind of traipses down through the throat, and some really dark wings. And moving into, there's a couple falcon species, many of which are hard to photograph. We were talking about a couple earlier on, like bat falcon, and there's also yellow-headed caracara, not pictured, and the crested caracara here, which is relatively common, especially in agricultural areas where there's a lot of cows and things like that. And the one thing that's unique about caracaras is that although they're in the member of the falcon family, they don't actually take live food. They mostly scavenge on carrion, which is quite interesting. Alrighty, so we're getting into some of folks' favorite birds, and I assure you we've got some colorful birds coming up soon. So there's a lot of different owl species in Costa Rica, and some of them are more easily observed during the daytime, like this ferruginous pygmy owl. We do have these in a couple places in the US, like South Texas and the Rio Grande Valley, as well as a couple very obscure locations in Southeast Arizona. But these birds are much more common in Central and South America in general. And there's a variety of different subspecies, and these are pint-sized assassins, as their name alludes to. The ferruginous pygmy owl is, very similar in size to northern saw-whet owl, northern pygmy owl. These owls are very small, and they predominantly feed on insects, and they also are obviously play an incredible role in the ecosystem by managing pests and insect numbers. So I'm sure folks know, don't put out rodenticides, use natural predators, and put up owl perches and posts in areas so that they can continue to be the natural predators. This was a really lucky encounter. We were celebrating a friend's birthday on the Pacific side, and we were out looking for birds, and we came back to the hotel or the Airbnb that we were staying at, and we saw these two birds fly in and perch under the palm tree. And normally I wouldn't approach a bird that close, but it was during the daytime. It had flown right in. I snapped a couple pictures because we were basically standing right there, and then let it enjoy itself. But this is also a very small owl. This is the Pacific screech owl. Now, getting into some nocturnal species, there's some really interesting owls in Costa Rica. This is the bare-shanked screech owl. Next up is the crested owl. As you can see, it's got this big white V on its face and some really, really subtle kind of cafe brown barring across the breast. And then the really enigmatic spectacled owl. All these pictures are from Juan Diego, as he spends a lot more time in the field than I do. And moving on to this very interesting family of birds called potus. And for anybody that's not heard of them before, they're really interesting. They're extremely cryptic, and there's a couple species in Latin America, including the gray potu, common potu, and the rufous potu. And this is the gray potu, and this was observed during our search for a bare-necked umbrella bird, which we'll get to in a little bit. And as you can see, you have to look up through the scope to see this bird, and more often than not, they're easy to miss, because what they do is they'll often perch on basically a snag that's like basically a dead tree, like a vertical tree stalk that is snapped off, and then they'll sit right on top of it to make it, and then they'll go into what's called a cryptic pose, where they'll turn their head up so that they basically are invisible and are essentially an extension of the post itself. And so if you're not paying attention, or you're not looking extremely hard for potus, you're probably not going to see them, which is just an homage to how well adapted they are for their environment and how incredible their camouflage is. Alrighty, hummingbirds, some of my favorite group of birds ever. Now, hummingbirds are obviously exclusively New World. We talked about that on our last presentation together. And although Costa Rica doesn't have the same level of diversity as places like Ecuador or Colombia, Costa Rica is, I think, 58 or 57 species of hummingbirds. So it is not too shabby. This is a purple-throated mountain gem. This is an adult male. And we've got a couple more coming up, like this fiery-throated hummingbird, which we'll see and photograph on the Central Sur tour alongside resplendent quetzals. Here's a green hermit, which is a trap lining hummingbird, which doesn't necessarily visit feeders, but visits heliconia flowers and kind of follows its paper route through the forest, visiting different flowers and bushes. This is the violet saberwing. This is an all-purple hummingbird that is very dominant when it comes to feeders, and it'll often displace other smaller-sized hummingbirds. And then the rufous-tailed hummingbird is sadly the trash hummingbird of Central America, even though it is arguably beautiful, more beautiful than many of the hummingbirds we have in North America. So the bar is quite high for hummingbirds in Latin America. And Costa Rica is no exception. And the fiery-throated hummingbird is probably the most colorful hummingbird in the world. It's definitely one of my top 5 favorite species. And when the light hits this species just right, you can see basically all of the colors of the rainbow on this bird. And it's it's a thing to behold, let me tell you. Now, there's a couple very small hummingbirds that are basically in like the bee hummingbird family. These are coquettes. And so these are relatively challenging to see, but with incredible local guides and amazing natural vegetation to attract these hummingbirds within their areas, that we stand good chances to see these species out in their natural environment. And these are both 2 different species, although they look very similar. On the left, we have the black-crested coquette. This is a male, excuse me, with its flashy ornaments. And then on the right-hand side, we have the white-crested, the white-crested coquette. These birds are very small, and they generally don't visit feeders. And so they love these stackies or verbena bushes to forage on these small little flowers, where you can often set up and wait for them and try and get some cool pictures. And keeping things going with fun hummingbirds, because who doesn't love hummers? Coppery-headed emerald and lesser violet ear, white-necked Jacobin, and snowcap. Now, some of these hummingbirds do a unique behavior, what's called lekking. And there's another species that we'll talk about a little bit later that also leks, but the lesser violet ear is a really common species that leks. And it basically, a lek is where a group of males basically sit in a defined area, and they either sing or dance or perform for females to attract them and mate with them. And so this lesser violet ear, it doesn't always sit in groups, but it will sit and sing like it is basically at a lek, and it will just repeat this same very high-pitched chip noise, hoping to attract a female. And as this lesser violet ear was perching, I was waiting for it to open its, I was trying to get it just right with its beak all the way open to put a little action in there. Now, the snowcap is probably one of the most sought after hummingbird species in Costa Rica, just because it has such a unique plumage. It's kind of this like magenta purple with this kind of snow white front on the top of its head. They're very small and sometimes can be challenging to track down, but a good guide and the right habitat knows where the snowcaps hang out. Now, closely related to hummingbirds are swifts, and as most folks know, swifts are extremely challenging to photograph, but there are a variety of swift species. Featured tonight, we just have a couple, including the white-collared swift, which is kind of a medium large-sized swift. You can see a little bit of the white collar field mark, and then there also is Vox's swift in Costa Rica as well. Obviously, we have those here in the US. Alrighty, keeping things going with cuckoos. So we obviously have some cuckoo species in the United States, like yellow-billed, black-billed, and mangrove cuckoo. But Costa Rica has a variety of other species that are not just named cuckoo. There's the groove-billed ani, as well as the smooth-billed ani. There's the striped cuckoo, which is found kind of in more upland grassland habitats. And then there's the squirrel cuckoo, which is generally widespread, and it has a long tail, and it's quite a large bird. And it moves around the vegetation and hopping from branch to branch, almost like a squirrel would jump. Now, there's one cuckoo to rule them all in Costa Rica, and that is the mythic rufous-vented ground cuckoo. Now, the ground cuckoo is kind of like what people call a ghost bird, because they are very hard to find in general. Although in the last couple of years, a lot of observations have been popping up, and people have been flocking, no pun intended, to Costa Rica to get this bird on their life list, as well as to observe it in its absolute majesty. Now, the rufous-vented ground cuckoo is really unique because it follows ant swarms. Now, there's a group of ants called army ants, and I believe there's something like 200 species of different army ants around the world. And the army ants are basically this traveling swarm of carnivorous ants that basically parade through the forest floor and up into the trees sometimes, looking for insects to eat. And so there's sometimes millions and millions and millions of ants in a swarm. And so as insects are fleeing for their lives, including insects, arthropods, small mammals. All these animals are fleeing for their dear life. There's other birds that are attracted to this commotion and feed off of the activity. And some species are what we call facultative ant followers and obligative ant followers. Now, facultative are basically they join the party when they want to. And then there's obligative ones, which basically are like constantly following the ant swarm wherever they go. And so if you want to see rufous vented ground cuckoo, your best bet is to look for army ant swarms. So getting into parrots and parakeets. So parrots generally have shorter tails and they squawk, and parakeets have longer tails. They're generally smaller and they squeak. So is it a squeaker or a squawker? And that's sometimes what we listen for when we're beginning birding in Latin America, trying to figure out what we're looking at, because they can be very challenging to identify as they look similar, and the vocalizations are hard to kind of tell between parrot species or between parakeet species. So a good way is to snap a picture of it in flight. And so first up, we have the white-fronted parrot. Next up, like I said, we have some parakeets. These are crimson-fronted parakeets. As you can see, they've got kind of trimmer wings, and they've got this kind of tapered long tail. We've got some more parrot species like the great green macaw, which can be found in the Caribbean lowlands on our northern tour. And these birds were also facing kind of extinction pressures within Costa Rica, but luckily conservation efforts have revivified this species and they're doing quite well. We've got a couple other parrot species. Brown-hooded is quite special. A lot of photographs come out of the cloud forest region of brown-hooded parrots as they come down to feeders quite readily. Now, everybody loves the scarlet macaw. I sure do. And these birds are pretty widespread in the Pacific lowlands, and where they feed on beech almonds and other like heavy nut producing trees. And on both tours, we should be able to see scarlet macaws quite well. And they're incredible. They're really loud. You often can hear them calling before you see them, and they often travel in pairs or in small groups where they descend upon a tree and begin diving in. Trogons and quetzals. Now, there's a lot of different trogon species in Costa Rica. I'm only going to show about 3 today. But as you can see, their body type is basically the same. They just changed their paint job. And so I just got my last trogon species in Costa Rica in December 2021, which is on the right-hand side, the lattice-tailed trogon. And these birds often sit from an exposed branch within the forest, but they're sometimes can be challenging to observe. And so, like many birds in the tropics, it's important to have a good ear or a guide with excellent hearing so that you can get put on to the location from where the bird is calling from. And these birds are closely related to our next species, which is the resplendent quetzal, which is the national bird of Guatemala, and also top targets in the world for birds, especially for birders who are coming to Costa Rica. Everybody wants to see a quetzal. And so we make a special visit to this area in the Talamanca Highlands, where there's kind of a cooperative of like a network of farmers who basically know where the quetzals live on their land, and they let the local lodges and the guides know where and when the quetzals are there. And so basically a lot of these lodges guarantee that people will see quetzals. And so there's places like Paraíso Quetzal, which is like probably one of the most famous places in Costa Rica to observe resplendent quetzals. However, they also are present in Monteverde, but I prefer to see them in the Talamanca Mountains because they're a little bit easier. And the resplendent quetzal is a member of the trogon family, and they feed on basically aguacatillos, which are like small fruits from the avocado family or Lauraceae. And they're important seed dispersers, and they're extremely sexually dimorphic, which means that these birds look very different between the sexes. This is obviously an adult male, and basically it takes several years for these birds to start growing out their long tail plumes. And after about 3 years, the immature birds will start growing out these long tail plumes. And I think there's about between 30,000 and 50,000 individuals currently in the wild. and they definitely face some hunting pressures in the past and other places. Like in Guatemala, for example, I don't think they're as readily available in terms of being able to observe them due to different hunting pressures. And so this is taken out in the Talamanca Highlands, where cloud forest days create really nice, flat, and even lighting. And there's some perches set up, as well as, like I said, this kind of cooperative network of local campesinos who let folks know, let the lodges know where these birds are, so that people can get guaranteed looks at these incredible birds. And this is obviously an image of one of those birds. Alrighty, kingfishers. Now, Costa Rica, I believe, has like 6 or 7 different species of kingfishers. I included 3 that aren't present in the United States. So on the top left, we have the American pygmy kingfisher, which is extremely small. It's like basically sparrow sized. On bottom left, we have the green kingfisher, which we can see in Southeast Arizona, as well as some places in South Texas. And then on the right, we have the green and rufous kingfisher. And so these birds are obviously found in wetland habitats, especially mangroves, where they sit out, like looking out above the water. And I'm sure folks have seen belted kingfishers, at the very least here in California, and their behaviors are all quite similar. But these guys are dressed in green and orange and very, very handsome. Alrighty, puffbirds and jacamars. Now, we don't have any of this family in the United States. And so these birds are quite interesting. They're very unique looking. Here's the rufous-tailed jacamar. The lanceolated monklet is quite rare in Costa Rica and hard to photograph. This was taken from a canopy tower looking down. That's why it has that unique perspective. And here's a white-fronted nunbird. A lot to say about these birds, but we're kind of running short on time, so I'm just going to keep it going. Now, motmots. These birds are also extremely unique. They have these long racket tails, which are quite fancy looking. This is the keel-billed motmot. Here's the turquoise-browed motmot. And then there's the broad-billed motmot and the Lessons motmot, which is probably the most widespread and most commonly photographed species of motmots in Costa Rica. And you can't really go wrong with any of the motmots, if you ask me. Alrighty, getting into some epic birds now. So barbets and toucans. So there's 2 species of barbet, I believe, in Costa Rica. And the first one we're going to talk about is the red-headed barbet. Again, this is a sexually dimorphic species, where the left is this really fire truck red-faced male, and on the right, kind of watermelon swim trunks female. These birds sometimes come down to feeders, but they also forage at all levels in the forest, feeding on a wide variety of prey. As you can see, they kind of have like a generalist beak, which allows them to kind of take advantage of nature's bounty. And then there's the prong-billed barbet, which is more appropriately camouflaged for its habitat. This was taken up in one of the cloud forest reserves in Monteverde. Now, getting into some toucans. So we're going to feature all of the toucan species you can see in Costa Rica, starting with the smallest, which is the northern emerald toucanet. And a lot to say about these birds. So toucans and toucanets in general are very interesting. As you can see, they have these ridiculously large and often really colorful beaks. And so these beaks are actually made of keratin, which is basically the same thing as our fingernails and our hair, more or less. And so the beaks are actually extremely lightweight, but extremely sturdy. And so if you look at it on a microscopic level or from like a cross section, there's these different really thin layers of keratin and then sponge in between. And then it's like these thin keratin layers and then like this really dense sponge and then keratin again. And so this allows the birds to feed on a variety of prey items, including berries, amphibians, lizards, baby birds, eggs, as well as fruits. And so the beak is really lightweight. And so up until recently, it wasn't really known what the function was. Like a lot of early naturalists thought it was for sexual selection or kind of more aggressive activities. But in fact, the beak is actually serves as like this incredible thermoregulation tool, similar in the sense to like elephants, how they kind of shunt the blood out there. But the bill of toucans and toucanets and these arasaris is actually like extremely more efficient in terms of thermoregulation. And so on hot days when it's extremely warm, the birds can basically send the blood out into these capillaries, these very small blood vessels that are within the beak, and allow the blood to cool down and allow the bird to cool. And then vice versa, they can basically put the blood back inside their body so that it, on cold nights, that it doesn't lower their overall body temperature too much. And one of the most sought after toucan species is the yellow-eared toucanet. This bird has eluded me thus far in Costa Rica, but I'm dying to see it for obvious reason. Alrighty, carpinteros or woodpeckers come in all different shapes and sizes in Costa Rica. Up top, we have the chestnut-colored woodpecker, which can be found in kind of the Caribbean lowlands at La Selva Biological Station, as well as this really tiny olivaceous piculet. These guys are sparrow-sized, but they basically do the same thing. They forage in trees, as well as the chestnut-colored woodpecker forages inside of bromeliads for small amphibians, like sometimes like tadpoles, as well as insects and things like that. All right, we're almost there. So we've got a black-cheeked woodpecker coming up, pale-billed woodpecker. These are the same size as like ivory-billed woodpeckers or imperial woodpeckers from Mexico. They're very large, and some of them have what we call like this double knock, where it's like you can hear them like knock twice on a tree, and that's like a great way to tune in to where they are and go try and find one. Jays in Costa Rica, there's quite a few. We're running a little bit out of time, and I put a lot of birds in here. It's the azure hooded jay, and then the white-throated magpie jay, found in kind of tropical dry forest lowland habitat. And then wood creepers. This is a really unique family of birds. They've got a really stiff tail and kind of woodpecker-like feet, so they can grip onto the bark, and they forage all throughout the upper parts of the trees, looking for insects as they scour in between bromeliads, looking in the lichens for insects, all throughout the trees. And some of them actually also attend to army ant swarms. Both of these birds were attending to an army ant swarm I observed recently. This is a northern barred wood creeper and a ruddy wood creeper, which I believe is endemic to Costa Rica. And the most ridiculously long beak of wood creepers is the brown-billed scythebill, which is obviously well adapted for probing into deep cracks, as well as examining bromeliads for anything that might be hiding in there. Now, moving forward with antbirds, or birds that follow ants, there's a lot of different birds that do this, but there's a specific group called antbirds, and some of them are kind of drab looking because they hang out in the dark understory of the forest, but they're really unique and hard to find, which makes them an interesting challenge. This is the chestnut-backed antbird, and getting a little bit more colorful is the bicolored antbird, and then getting a little bit more fancy is the barred ant shrike, and then getting crazy fancy is the ocellated antbird. Cotingas. This is also a ridiculous family. There's really, really colorful fruit-eating birds of different sizes and colors. On our left is the yellow-billed cotinga, and on the right is the turquoise cotinga. These birds can be tricky, very tricky to find, especially these blue varieties of cotingas, like the turquoise and the lovely. And there's also this epic cotinga called the bare-necked umbrella bird, which is extremely hard to find in Costa Rica, and some people go on missions looking for them. I did one of those missions, and we lucked out and found one. Now, probably the most ridiculous cotinga in Latin America is the three-wattled bellbird, or I guess in Costa Rica. The three-wattled bellbird is crazy. It has a call that can be heard a mile away. It's basically like the bong of like a bell, because they all of a bell. And in Spanish, the bird is called the pájaro campana, and it's what we call an altitudinal migrant. And so it basically has this corridor from the Pacific lowlands down into like Punta Arenas, where it spends part of the year, and then it migrates back up into the high elevation areas of Monteverde and this kind of cloud forest areas where it feeds on fruits. And my girlfriend just heard her first bellbird of the season today in Monteverde. So this is right around the time that they start going back up to the highlands. And here's one calling. And as you can see, its namesake, it's got these three really long wattles, which are produced for sexual selection. And these birds feed also on fruits. And they play an incredibly important role in seed dispersal because they go get a fig or a small little avocado from the avocado trees, and a specific type of avocado. And Ocateo monteverdensis is like this endemic species. And so the wattled bellbirds basically eat them, but they eat the fleshy fruit, but they can't actually like swallow the seed. And so they regurgitate it. But as you can see from this image, they sit out in exposed perches in kind of patchy areas. And so as they regurgitate the seed into these open areas where there's actually more sunlight and less vegetative cover, it actually has like, I think, it doubles the success rate of the seedlings growing into trees. So they're actually really incredible in terms of their seed dispersal and their impacts for reforesting areas. Alrighty, manakins. Long-tailed manakins, white-crowned manakins, white-collared manakins, and red-capped manakins. All of these birds perform in leks. They display, they dance, they jump, they hop, they have alpha males, beta males, gamma males. They all just like get crazy. This is probably the most famous of all the mannequin dancers. This one does its like crazy little moonwalk. So if I were you, Google red-capped mannequin like on YouTube dancing, and you'll be blown away by the moves that these birds do. All right, we're almost out of time, so I'm gonna see where we're at. There's a lot more birds. Okay, so I'm not gonna go through all of them. There's a couple more that I'll share with you guys. So one of the endemic species of Costa Rica is a wood warbler. It's a flame-throated warbler found up in the highlands, and it is very fancy. There's a couple of endemic species or near endemic species like this white-eared ground sparrow. This is a ubiquitous sparrow, the rufous collared sparrow. And then even the finches are quite epic. These are different euphonias. There's some subtle differentiation in terms of how much yellow is in the throat and where they're found in the country. Cardinals and grosbeaks, they've got quite a few, including the blue grosbeak, hepatic tanager, summer tanager, and then the cream of the crop of like true tanagers. Now, there's a lot of tanagers that migrate, like I said in the last group, neotropical tanagers that migrate here, but there's also year-round tanagers that are just ridiculous, including the bay-headed tanager, emerald tanager, golden-hooded tanager, spangled-cheeked tanager, scarlet-rumped tanager, crimson-collared tanager, and the banana kit, which is kind of like a cheater tanager. We could talk about that one another time. Silver-throated tanager, speckled tanager, buff-throated saltator, red-legged honey creeper. Some of my favorites are like the toucans, tanagers, and hummingbirds for obvious reasons. And so there's a couple of blackbird species. We're not going to get into those so much, but it's not just the birds that are incredible in Costa Rica. And like I said, it's extremely well developed in terms of its ecotouristic opportunities and conservation mindset. And there's some beautiful lodges like the Arenal Observatory Lodge, the Paraíso Quetzal Lodge, which is an amazing, these places have amazing blends of lodging, food, hummingbird feeders, fruit feeders, and just like incredible ambiance for obvious enjoyment. This is the Danta Corcovado Lodge, Hotel Villa Lapas, and Caña Negra, which is one of the spots that we visit in the northern wetlands where we can see a lot of waders and shorebirds as well as other things. So I kind of rushed through that last section, but I wanted to make sure that everybody got out of here on time. So thank you guys so much for sticking